Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. Now, a lot of you were blown away by how Annie Nelson deadlifted this 235 kilos at 69 kilo body weight. Now, not only is that an incredibly impressive deadlift at that body weight at all, but what was even more impressive was just how fast and powerful this barbell moved for about 90% of that deadlift. And he makes use of something that's incredibly interesting in terms of sports science, but can also be, more interestingly for you, incredibly valuable for your deadlift from the floor if you struggle with speed off the floor or feeling like the barbell is moving really slow. And he makes use of something known as a dynamic start, and this dynamic start makes use of a biological phenomenon known as the stretch shortening cycle. Now, you'll see when Annie gets up to the barbell, she lifts up her hips are stretched, so her hamstrings and glutes are stretched. Then she quickly brings her hips down in what's known as a pump or a hip pump, very short distance, and then begins the pull and moves that barbell very, very fast off the floor. This is something a lot of athletes will do in the deadlift or in weightlifting and the snatch or clean and jerk very intuitively, but it's a biological phenomenon that's been investigated for quite literally decades. The Soviets would have investigated this in their weightlifters as early as 1971, and there's a very interesting investigation on that, which we'll touch on in just a minute. Now, the stretch shortening cycle is something you've probably heard of in relation to running, maybe you've heard of it in relation to jumping, and possibly in some circumstances with the kind of plyometric training in some people's training when they're athletes. The stretch shortening cycle is a phenomenon known as a pre-stretched muscle produces more force. Quite simply, your muscles do more work if you pre-stretch them. Now, the investigation is often done on jumping, plyometric work, running, repetitive explosive movements, but we don't see a lot of that investigation done on weighted or resisted movements too frequently, and there's not a lot of research on that, but thankfully we don't particularly need research specific to that, although it would be nice because we know reasonably well what's happening. Now, there's not a full cohesive model of what is causing the stretch shortening cycle to work. There's a lot of different elements at play. More of these are becoming apparent as sports science progresses and the biological information progresses along that, but there's several different parts included in the stretch shortening cycle that quite literally make it work and make it work very well. So one of the most common and most well understood models, or the first part of that stretch shortening cycle that was proposed, was the elastic properties of tendons. So tendons are incredibly good at amplifying force from movements from the muscle. So muscles that do work by themselves in absence of an elastic tendon don't produce as much force as muscles that work in cohesion with tendons. Quite simply, the elastic properties of the tendon, when it's stretched in that static or that dynamic start position, when we lift up those hips, we're stretching the tendons involved in hip extension and then contracting them really aggressively. And then there's quite literally elastic energy used in this process. So this is one of the phenomenon. It is kind of a physical phenomenon, quite well understood, but there seems to be several other parts of this that are involved. Originally, it was thought that primarily the elastic properties were related to the tendon, but it seems that there is some growing evidence that the certain portion of the muscle also has something known as the viscoelastic properties that we also see in tendons, and that this stretch also gives us some of this elastic recoil. So originally, it was primarily thought that the tendon was doing the majority of that elastic profile, but now it seems that certain parts of the muscle group also have viscoelastic properties. There also appears to be a neurological aspect to this. So there's something known as muscle tixophatry. So muscle tixophatry is when a muscle is at rest, it provides passive resistance. So your posture, for example, isn't something you necessarily need to think about. As we're sitting here, maybe you're sitting on the train, you're sitting at your desk, or eating food, you're not really thinking about your posture. You know, when you're going to deadlift, you're thinking about a lot of different sections of that movement. When you set up, when you set your back, how you move your feet. But as you sit here, until I've probably made you aware of it, you're not really thinking about your lower back or your upper back, but you're not in a puddle of mush on the floor. Your body is maintaining some level of resistance, and this is known as muscle tixostrophy, or specifically the history-dependent properties of a muscle. Now, this is incredibly useful for everyday activity where we don't want to specifically think about things, where we don't want to specifically think about every action we're doing. We want to concentrate on our task and not have to worry about our posture. This, however, in sport and movement might not necessarily be the best thing if we're looking to increase quality of movement or speed of movement as fast as possible. Now, muscle hypertrophy, or this kind of passive resistance, is something that dissipates very, very quickly once you begin that movement, but it is there, and repeated movements have less or no history-dependent properties. So the previous movement, if you're moving fast, if you're in motion, will continue to be a better quality movement in terms of neurological aspect. So this pre-stretch seems to dissipate this muscle hypertrophy and provides you with a faster movement. So this little inhibitory passive movement, so if you're setting up and you're static in that deadlift, you are minorly, but certainly to a certain extent, if we're trying to improve our deadlift as much as possible, in a slightly resisted position. So when you begin that movement, there's a little bit of extra resistance that is not always, but sometimes for some lifter feels a little bit better, but not always ideal for that lifter to move freely and more aggressively. So we've got a neurological aspect, and then we've got these physical aspects, these elastic properties of our muscles and our tendons, and we get a combination of these to produce a more powerful deadlift. Now, while the stretch shortening cycle is present in everybody, and obviously some athletes are more powerful, their neurological makeup is better, they have faster and quicker transmission of neurotransmitters, their muscle fiber makeup is more inclined towards type 2X or type 2A, faster makeup, bigger joints, a whole host of genetic aspects that make you probably better at lifting. But the stretch shortening cycle is something that everyone can make use of. Unless you've some extreme genetic issue or mutation, you can almost certainly make use of the stretch shortening cycle, but it might not be the best thing for you depending on certain circumstances. What I want you to try first, unless you have a big competition coming up or you're a couple of weeks away from your maxing, if you currently use a static start, I would really like for you to try a dynamic start. And if you currently use a dynamic start, just try for a couple of sessions a static start and see how it feels. There's a good percentage of the population who are unable to maintain good positions with a dynamic start, but then there's a lot of people, once you practice enough, have very good results from a really aggressive dynamic start. There's a couple of pros and cons to each one of these. Static start allows for excellent consistency of technique and is probably best for most beginners. But for the vast majority of elite lifters, we're trying to pull those bigger weights. For example, in Andy's case here, we're pulling 235 kilos. The use of that dynamic start does become very, very valuable because the weights are getting so heavy. There is, of course, world records, and some lifters do remain very static, but they are in the minority, but that doesn't mean that you're not one of those lifters. So the first place we start is just trying out either the dynamic start or the static start, whichever you don't do currently, and see how it feels. In general, most of our lifters will tend towards a reasonable dynamic start. It doesn't need to be super aggressive. It doesn't need to be really extravagant. It doesn't need to be a sumo deadlifter's voodoo magic before a setup. Quite literally, you can see in Annie's case here, just a little hip pump, pre-stretch those muscles, and then aggressively start pulling that barbell. The issue that comes in with dynamic start compared to static starting is inconsistency of technique with the dynamic start. In the static start, lifters are able to correctly sequence and repeatedly sequence the same positions each time. We're ensuring our back angle is the same, we're ensuring our shoulder position is the same, we're ensuring that our tension in our upper back and our arms is the same, we're ensuring that our knee and shin angle is the same, we're ensuring lots of different joint angles are the same and consistent. And if you're coached right or you're able to find those positions, you can consistently ensure that you're in that same position every time, and then you can perfect your technique. And then when the weights get really heavy, you can rely on this consistent technique all the way up to those weights. However, technique is fantastic, but eventually it is powerlifting. You do need to be strong and producing a lot of force. And so technique isn't everything at the end of the day. So it might be worth time, if you've spent a lot of time with a static start as a newer lifter, is slowly bringing in a dynamic start to make your lift a little bit more powerful. The real key here to look at is that you're really watching for a couple of aspects that we see as cons from the dynamic start. Two most common cons we'll see, or two most common negatives we'll see from the dynamic start, is loss of a position in the upper back and generally a bumping of the barbell away. So very sorry to one of my lifters, Jamie, you were just the most recent person I saw. Quite literally in the same day before I recorded this, you'd sent this video in. This is Jamie, and I don't think he'll mind. We'll just zoom in on the video. He's pulling 270 for triples here, and you'll see him using a dynamic start, but we'll see that barbell bumping away from him. Now, Jamie's a horse. He's an absolute animal. He's very, very strong, as you can see by his deadlifts. But even the strongest person in the world, the best deadlifter ever, whoever you want to think that is, let's say Hafthor, for example, when Hafthor was pulling 501, if you move this barbell further away from him, no matter how much force production he has available to him, the further that barbell gets away from us, eventually we are making it incredibly mechanically disadvantageous to us, and as a result makes this lift much worse. So if we bump this barbell away from us in this dynamic start, we end up making the lift much harder and in effect making that barbell feel heavier. So we have to be super conscious of where that barbell starts on the floor. Now, very often this problem can be solved by simply saying, don't bump the barbell away, just become conscious of it. A lot of lifters aren't even aware of this. Even this tiny deviation away from us can make for a very difficult deadlift, or much harder than it needs to be. So just be super conscious of not bumping that barbell away. Don't start with the barbell in really far over the arch of your foot. It should be just at the end of your arch, if you can imagine, and just behind the base of your big toe in general for most people. So when you look down at your shoe in the deadlift, and if you look straight down at the barbell, it should be just a little bit behind your laces, but it shouldn't be back near the start of your laces. If it is, it's probably too straight, because we do want some forward inclination of our shin angle, because we want to engage our quads as much as possible on the floor, because it really helps with that first pull and extending up through that first pull or the initial separation of the barbell. So unless your shins are fully vertical which you pull, which we don't recommend, this will generally mean that the barbell is too close to you if it's over the top of your laces. So move that down just near the end of your laces, behind the base of your big toe, kind of at the end of your arch in your foot if you'd like to visualize it that way. And this ensures then when you do use your dynamic start, you're being conscious of not bumping the barbell away, but you're also being conscious of making sure that the barbell starts in the right position so we can get a reasonably straight or reasonably smooth bar pad back towards us. This also pulls you forward and pulls your balance forward. So even if you're very strong, eventually a heavy barbell will cause some issue. And so if you bump that barbell away, it's just going to pull your shoulders forward. And what often happens then is we see a change in back angle, or specifically a level of back flexion or extension. So depending on what way you start, maybe you start with a neutral back, whatever that means to you. Maybe you start with a slightly flexed back. Maybe you start with a really strong extended back. What we'll often see is if people start with this back position and they bump this barbell away in the dynamic start, we'll end up generally seeing a tendency towards upper back flexion. Now, your views on whether this will cause injury in the long run are irrelevant, because this generally makes for a little bit of worse movement, because as we're in motion, if the deadlift is already moving and we're moving positions with our back, this generally messes up our balance and makes for worse performance. So some people may make the argument that it's a better lever. It may or may not be, depending on the circumstances. But what's certainly not a good idea is movement under this load, because we're generally getting pulled out of position. So if we're moving into more flexion, no one really moves into more extension. That would be quite interesting if someone does. But generally people move into more flexion as they begin pulling. But generally what happens is we'll be pulled out of position, we'll be pulled forward, or we'll end up having quite a terrible lockout because of this. So when you're doing that dynamic start, make sure that the barbell isn't being bumped away and you're maintaining whatever level of back flexion or extension or whatever position that's in. You're maintaining that as you're pulling and you're not letting it change. So the two of these, once sorted, are generally the major problems involved in the dynamic start, and very often it's much more productive. So there is a certain level of lifters who just can never get used to the dynamic start. They're just in a position where it doesn't feel very good. It feels like you're always out of position. It feels too aggressive. Some lifters are a little bit more thoughtful about this lift, and even though it might, in theory, produce more force for them, it doesn't necessarily allow for the best technique. So we do have to accommodate for all those aspects. And these lifters generally will also not always enjoy the aggressive psychological part of the dynamic start. So some lifters, super aggressive, want to pull on that barbell. They're really hyped up, they love it, they pull those big weights, and they can do it consistently and it works great. But for some lifters, when they use that dynamic start, they feel this kind of rushing of the psychological process. Their pre-performance routine is really messed up from this really aggressive dynamic start, and sometimes they can get used to it, but sometimes it's just something that never feels comfortable and they can't hit that right sequence of technique. And even though in theory it might produce more force, it results in them just not having a better quality lift. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions about the deadlift or this part of that deadlift, the dynamic or static start, I'm more than happy to answer them. If you'd like to improve your deadlift, check out the Sika pull program. It's a 10-week program, 2 sessions per week. You can get it on the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. 7-day free trial for everyone who signs up, and a lot of great PBs out of that. If you have any questions, do please let me know below, and I hope you enjoyed today's video.